Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host, Simon Wamsley. One of my writers in this case, Matt. Thank you, Matt, has written me an episode, The Casanova Killer. I hate it when they have this, like the genius killers, the sexy killer. It's like, no. Just like the dickhead killer would work. Can I say dickhead this early in the episode? Bleep that out just in case. But you get what I mean. Like the dickhead killer, the piece of killer. But no, the Casanova Killer. I got a picture of him here. Look how sexy he looks. Look at that cigarette. Oh, yes. Isn't it weird? Like the cigarette industry has done such a tobacco industry, that's what it's called, right? Has done such a good job because it's like all I've been told my entire life is how cigarettes will kill you. Like even when I was a kid, you'd see like adverts for cigarettes and like half of it would be like smoking kills your baby, smoking cuts your eyes out and burns them, this kind of stuff. But still, because of movies and I'm sure money, I'm still like, yeah, but cigarettes, look at that guy, look how cool he looks. Anyway, sorry, enough with that. Let's jump into it. What would you do for fame and glory? That's a question a lot of people have thought about at least once in their lives, and the answer always varies, from making stupid videos on the internet to trying to break world records to some saying they go so far as committing murder. My answer's yeah. Well, I'd make stupid videos on the internet, breaking world records. Yeah. Murder? No, not worth it, because that's not fame, that's infamy. What's that famous quote? If I can't get famous, infamy will do. It just goes to show how far some people will go for something trivial and meaningless. Oh, come on. Fame and notoriety, Matt. Not truly meaningless, they're awesome. Fame can be wonderful, but more often than not, it comes with a price, one that needs to be paid, whether you're totally willing or not. Yes, there's a price. What is it to be good looking? Excellent question. Most of the time when people think about the concept of being good looking, it's about looking beautiful, pretty, or handsome. Many people are naturally gifted with exceptional facial features and bodies to match. Of course, there are times when this too comes with its downside. Traits such as vanity, narcissism, and arrogance have been displayed many times by those society has labeled as good looking. So what happens when you combine physically attractive traits, a burning desire to be famous and recognized, and a twisted moral code? Well, you get a YouTuber. No, I'm just kidding. You get this dude, Paul John Knowles. Or I think it's more accurate to say you get a TikToker, wouldn't you? Famous to be recognized, twisted moral code. Those immoral TikTokers. Now that name might not be familiar to many, since on the long list of serial killers like Dahmer or Gacy that have plagued the US in the last century or so, he isn't brought up nearly as much. However, Knowles would cut a swath of death across more than 5 states, including Georgia, Florida, Texas, Nevada, and Alabama, with his body count climbing as high as 18, while he claims to have killed up to 35 people in total, all within the best span of about 4 months. Wait, why is this guy not as famous as Ted Bundy? He was also handsome and murdery. The reason? Well, not only did these people have things he wanted for himself, but it became very clear after everything was said and done that Knowles simply wanted to be famous. He wanted to be remembered as one of the worst serial killers in American history, and he was well on his way to accomplishing that goal when his reign of terror was cut short. To quote retired FBI agent Ronnie Angel, "If you told me you killed 100, I could believe that." So, as the darkness engulfs us once more, have a seat as I spin for you the tale of a man once described as a dreamboat, as well as pure evil. He was a cross between Robert Redford and Ryan O'Neal, while also being more brutal than Ted Bundy. Quite the claim. So hold on to your butts, everybody. This is the tale of Paul John Knowles, the Casanova Killer. Again, just going to go through it. The dickhead killer. That's what we're going to call him from now on. Hello there. Just before we continue with today's video, let me share something very special with you. Look, wine. It used to be fun, but somewhere along the way, it got all fancy. It got all intimidating. You're in the store and you're like, I don't even know what this grape is. What is this wine? Why is it so expensive? Well, look, that's where Bright Cellars comes in. Bright Cellars believe that wine is meant to be enjoyed. Strange thing, that, isn't it? And they're on a mission to bring the fun back to wine. With over 600,000 5-star ratings, they've proven that finding the perfect wine should be easy and enjoyable. And here's how it works. You take a quiz, 7 questions, nothing too complicated, and then wine sourced from around the world delivered right to your doorstep. And the best part, you can customize your preferences and ratings to improve your future matches. It's like having your own personal wine concierge. Bright Cellars makes wine your way. The wine aisle can be scary. With Bright Cellars, it's like having the joy of wine delivered straight to your door. Plus, each box comes with these
these handy cards to help you learn more about each bottle. And here's the best part. If you ever get a bottle that you're not vibing with, no worries, your Bright Cellars concierge will replace it. With spring right around the corner, it is the perfect time to discover new wines with Bright Cellars. And speaking of spring, why not organize a party? Get your friends round, try a blind tasting. Bright Cellars have got you covered. Bright Cellars are giving you your first 6-bottle subscription box, which is usually $150 plus for just $55. Click the link in the description below or go to brightcellars.com/TCC. Take the quiz and let the wine adventure begin. Thank you, Bright Cellars, for sponsoring, and now back to today's video.
PJK. Starting with a quote. I'm a criminal, and I've been a criminal since I was a little kid. Paul Knowles was born in Orlando, Florida on April the 25th, 1946, to parents Thomas Jefferson Knowles and Bonnie Knowles, née Strickland, one of 7 children. Knowles knew hardship from the word go, with the house they lived in being too small to comfortably accommodate a family of 9. 9 is so many. 7 children? Jesus, I have 2. And I live in, not a small house. And I'm like, it's so busy in here. They didn't even have a proper bathroom, and the whole family was forced to share an outhouse in the backyard. And of course, it's here that we come across an old friend of the channel, good old-fashioned childhood beatings. Thomas Knowles was an angry, violent man, and he would dish out what he liked to call whippings if his children were ever bad or ticked him off. He beat them with his belt, and he beat them with his fist, so much so that it left black and blue welts all over their bodies. Don't fuck up your kids, guys. We keep saying it over and over, don't we ever, Matt? And what of his mother? Well, Bonnie Knowles could perhaps be considered to be Paul John Knowles' first love. He adored her. He loved her deeply, as all young children love their mothers, but this was in stark contrast to how she allowed him and the rest of the children to be treated by their father. Now, back in the day, and of course today, there are many times when we see the mother being utterly subservient to her husband. Yeah, I'm like, steady on. It's not her fault. I'm assuming, she's like, well, I'm going to get beaten as well, aren't I? Seen as unable to raise a hand or voice to protect her children. Sadly, this was the case here, and Bonnie was unable to save Knowles from her father's torment. Exactly. It's not her fault. She's just as much a victim as the kids. I mean, maybe not just as much, but also a victim. Just as much. I don't know, I see kids, they're so defenseless. Even in this situation, where the mother is totally helpless, it's like, she's not a kid, though. It's just worse when it's kids. We shouldn't be ranking how bad it is. Like this, it's grim. It's like I used to do a channel called Top 10s, and be like, I don't want to do videos where it's like top 10 cereal. I'm sure I've done them, but it's like, it always feels a bit like, you shouldn't be ranking people by awfulness, should we? It feels a bit dirty. This, of course, didn't leave the best impression on young Paul. His father had drilled into him that if he told anyone about the abuse at home, he and his siblings would be sent off to foster care, and Thomas's treatment of his children would only get worse from there. Sadly, it seemed to work, and Knowles and his siblings said nothing about their abuse at home, and so they simply externalized the pain on the world around them. At only 8 years old, Knowles was already committing crimes, mostly petty theft around town, and his brothers were usually right there with him. And I have to start somewhere, right? He was a terror at school, didn't do his assignments or homework, disobeyed his teachers, and beat up other kids on the playground. As he and his brothers grew into their teenage years, they began getting into more trouble with the police. Their crimes had gotten more overt, and they were bringing a lot of attention to the family, which pissed Thomas off something fierce. Oh, well, I know what the solution is, Thomas. Just beat them more. Just beat some sense into them. That'll figure it out, because it's worked so well so far. Then one day, Thomas had had enough. His kids were bringing too many unwanted eyes on him and the family as a whole. In his mind, he was smart enough to do his abusive crimes at home in secret, but they were out there doing crimes and getting in trouble for everybody to see. And so, without any sort of warning, he contacted social services and had every one of his children put into foster care. He didn't care about them. He didn't love them. They were simply annoyances to him at this point. So why do you have 7 of them, Knowles? Christ! Undoubtedly, Knowles turned to his mother to try and stop this from happening, but as always, Bonnie had no say in the matter. Thomas was the man of the house, and so she just listened to him, unwillingly casting her son out for what would be the first of many times, breaking his heart in the process. Knowles would never see his parents again. Despite being sent to foster care, Knowles kept up his criminal ways. He would go out to parties, would spend what money he had at arcades, and instead of going home, he'd end up sleeping in the woods. Eventually, it got to be too much for his foster parents to handle, and he was transferred to Florida's Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. So, what do we know about this school? Well, we know that it is something similar to what Simon would call a Borstal school. It was a complete and utter hellhole, and boys were sent there for a variety of reasons, whether it be running away from home or simply for smoking behind their schools, but they all received the same kind of treatment. When there's blood splatter on the walls of a school and the teachers don't even bother to clean it up, you know you're in a rotten place. Fucking hell, that is intense. I don't know why I'm laughing, it's so horrible. Over the years, over 500 former residents of the school have come forward about the awful treatment they received there. Beatings and other brutal punishments were a daily occurrence, to the point where the beatings were compared to outright torture and even led to the death of multiple students. The fuck? The teachers are beating the students to death? Is that true? One man by the name of Jerry Cooper recounted his time at the school, saying that one night he was taken from his bed by the staff at 2 a.m, led to a small building the residents called the White House, and was thrown onto a bed, had his feet bound, and was then beaten mercilessly with a leather strap a total of 135 times until he passed out from the pain. To quote him, "The first blow lifted me 1.5 feet off that bed, and every time that strap would come down, you could hear the shuffle on the concrete because their shoes were sliding, and you could hear the shoosh, shoosh, bam." On June the 30th, 2011, the school was thankfully shut down. That was only 13 years ago! What? But it didn't erase the horrors that its students had endured. It's been reported that up to 81 students thought to have died on the premises. Importantly, it's been reported that. We're not saying it's a statement of fact, it's just what people have reported. With over 50 bodies being found buried on the school grounds after its demolition, all of which are thought to have been outright murdered. What the fuck is happening, America? What the fuck? How is this not a huge scandal? Wasn't that the thing in Canada? Look at this shit. What the fuck? Or maybe this is a huge scandal and just not being an American, I've never heard of it. But good lord, 50 bodies? Most murdered? I don't understand. This is the place that Knowles was sent to, and it begs the question of whether it led to why he turned out the way that he did. I mean, look, he had a pretty rough upbringing. He was into crimes early on. He got sent off to foster care, and then he got sent to this horrible place. I'd say it's all just a combination of these factors, plus probably some intrinsic brain thing that made him into who he became. It's not one or the other, but bloody hell, this certainly helped, didn't it? He continued to commit small crimes here and there and was sent back to Doja numerous times. At the age of 19, he continued his robbing ways, after which he was sentenced to spend 6 months at Rampage Prison, which is now known as Florida State Prison. The constant beatings, the constant abuse, the constant incarceration, it wore Paul John Knowles down both mentally and emotionally. His brother Clifton Knowles maintains that it was this repeated pattern that turned Knowles into the monster that he would soon become. To quote him, "It institutionalized him instead of reforming him. He didn't go in a killer. He was just a wayward soul that got tired of the beatings when he was a young'un and got away from it the best way he knew how at the time." And one thing led to another. The state of Florida has a hand in this too. They'll deny it until hell won't have it, but the state of Florida has a responsibility to this too. End quote. The straw. And that brings us to 1974, and Knowles is once again behind bars at Rampage Prison. Why exactly was he behind bars this time? Well, it was for kidnapping a police officer at gunpoint. Oh my lord, how that is a life crime, isn't it? Like, crimes against police are more serious, somehow, right? Kidnapping a police officer at gunpoint, isn't that the sort of thing that gets you 25 to life? Paul John Knowles was pulled over for speeding one night, and the loan officer had a dream that I was pulled over for speeding last night. You know, sometimes in the day, you have no idea, no, I didn't have any dreams. And then you're like, oh my God, I totally did. I had a dream that I was pulled over for speeding. And the loan officer came to speak to him. So what does Knowles do in this situation? He gets out of the car, steals the officer's gun, holds him at gunpoint, and tells him to get in the car. The officer complies, and the two of them proceed to drive all about town for 2 whole hours before Knowles simply drops him off and drives off. So what was the point of that? I have no idea, but Knowles was eventually arrested for that and was sentenced to 10 years in Rampage Prison. Good, not long enough. You shouldn't kidnap an officer. Also, that officer's going to be like, he's definitely going to kill me because he's seen your face and he knows what's coming. And good lord. I imagine he was just driving around for 2 hours because he was like, oh, what the f*** am I supposed to do? Do I have to kill this guy? I don't know. Should I let him go? He's probably just thinking. While serving out his sentence, Knowles had gotten his hands on an American astrology magazine. He had always taken an interest in those sorts of things and checked his horoscopes every single day. Horoscopes for prison must be very easy. What do you foresee for the near future? More prison, mate. Lots more prison. Same routine over and over again. Always curious about what the stars had to say about his life. Very little. They're stars. They're giant burning balls of hydrogen and stuff. Hydrogen and helium? What's in stars? It's just burning away in the sky, not predicting your future, that's what. In this specific magazine, there just happened to be an article about the magazine owner's daughter. See, she was Angela Kovitz, a recent divorcee and cocktail waitress in San Francisco, California. Knowles liked what he saw and he started writing to her. Angela received her first letter and was instantly enraptured by his charm, as well as his lovely handwriting. Angela. Stop. Come on. In one such letter, later described as childish and swaggering, he wrote, "There's only two things I like to do on a rainy day, sleep and make love. And I very seldom get sleepy." Oh, cringe, bro. That is childish. It's like, that's the little thing a 16-year-old writes. Stop it. They bonded over their shared interest in horoscopes and similar topics like fortune-telling. Eventually, it got to the point where, thanks to Knowles' inherent charm, she fell head over heels for him and soon made the trip across the country to visit him in jail. Oh, was she in California and he's in Florida? That's a long-ass way. And when he popped the question during that said visit, she accepted without hesitation. Yes, it's another one of those cases, Simon. The ones that I feel we run into far too often. Yeah, it's so cringe. I don't understand this. It was because of this love and devotion to him that Angela, out of her own pocket, paid for his defense and legal fees, hiring accomplished lawyer Sheldon Yavitz to take his case. In recounting his experience with Knowles, he recounted the following. "I worked for people who paid me and were professional criminals. Knowles was a criminal, a repeated criminal, should have been a professional criminal, but he was an amateur. Pleasant. He was always pleasant. He didn't use curse words, he wasn't rude, he was polite, he was sort of passive to some extent. There was nothing that would make you think he was a killer. When I first met him as a burglar, he was just a loser, a guy that couldn't stay out of jail." Quote ends. In May of 1974, Yavitz managed to convince the parole board to grant Knowles his freedom. Wait, how long was he in prison? When did he go in? 1974. Wait, he gets out immediately? What the fuck? Or did we skip ahead to 1970? I don't know. How long was he in jail, Matt? And on that same day, he was on a plane to San Francisco to see Angela and finally marry her. It should be noted that Angela was a short woman, older than Knowles, and wasn't seen as overly attractive to most. So what was it that Knowles saw in her that convinced him that she was the one and that he needed to marry her? Maybe the fact that she has money and was paying for your lawyer and got you out of prison? But then he's like, oh, okay, I'll go for it anyway. Maybe to get more money? I don't know. One word, money. Oh, there we go. It's money. Angela Kovitz was loaded, and he considered her to be his meal ticket, his chance at the good life, along with maybe his last real chance at happiness. His life had been an utter misery up to that point. Beatings from his dad, beatings from the teachers at Dozier School, constantly in trouble for petty crimes he was caught for, and now he had the love of this woman to look forward to. But of course, it was never going to be as simple as that. As soon as Knowles and Angela started living together, they started having issues. What a surprise! It was just a shocking outcome. Small issues, sure, but issues. Normal things that could have easily been ironed out in the weeks or months that a normal relationship would have afforded. But when your relationship with your significant other is made up of nothing more than paper and ink before you shack up together, that's going to cause some problems to crop up. And the final straw of the whole thing? Well, soon after moving in together, Angela went to see a psychic. I can already feel Simon cringe as I write that, but let me explain. Angela, like Knowles, was a huge believer in that sort of thing, horoscopes and psychic readings going hand in hand, and so she wished to have her fortune told. Said fortune? That a dark presence had entered her life, that a bad man had arrived and would cause her nothing but misery. Now, we all know there's no way this psychic could have known about Knowles. That was all Angela needed. Wait, surely the psychic could have known about Knowles. It's called cold reading. It's where he's like, the psychic asks these questions that kind of get her to reveal little details that the psychic pries into and then somehow knows stuff about you, even though you don't think that you told them that. They definitely knew. Combined with the problems they were already having, she went home, told Knowles it was over, the engagement was kaput, and she kicked him out there and then. So I know what you must be thinking. Well, Matt, this has been fascinating, but why is this chapter named The Straw? Oh, I wasn't thinking that, but now I am. Well, the meaning is actually twofold. Not only was the psychic reading the last straw for Angela, but her kicking him to the curb was the last straw for Knowles. While nothing has been proven to this day, it's believed he went off into the night in a pure rage, and 3 women lost their lives. We don't know if this is true. We don't know their names, but it is generally accepted to be true. After that, Knowles made his way onto a flight back to Florida, where he was picked up by his brother. Angela had been his final shot at happiness, his final shot at love, his final shot at the good life. Oh, chill, Knowles. She paid for you to get out of prison. All you had to do is write a few stupid letters. With that now gone, whatever fragile piece of sanity his mind had snapped, and Knowles knew what he had to do. If he couldn't have the good life, if he couldn't have some form of normalcy, then he would be infamous. He would be the most hated killer the world had ever seen. 4 months of hell. With Knowles back home, he didn't waste any time getting down to his dark business. Said business started out only with a whimper, but rapidly grew into a roar. On the night of July the 26th, 1974, Knowles was out at a bar after a few drinks. He got into an altercation with some other patrons and a bar fight ensued in which Knowles stabbed a bartender. The police were called, they took Knowles in, no fuss, no muss, at least that's what they thought. It turns out that Knowles knew a thing or two about lockpicking, and while the officers weren't paying him any mind, he managed to pick the lock on his detention cell and escape into the night. Now, normally we say that it doesn't take too long for escapees to get caught and brought to justice, but not this time. Yeah, it's really surprising how quickly someone who's escaped from prison ends up back in prison. It's usually like days. On the movies, you're kind of like, oh no, they get away forever, or like for a long ass time. No, in reality, most people just end up back in prison real quick with a fat extra bit of time on their sentence. While on the run, Knowles found himself outside the house of retired Jacksonville Beach teacher, 65-year-old Alice Henrietta Curtis. She was simply relaxing for the night, not a care in the world, when Knowles made his merry way inside. After entering her home, Knowles bound and gagged her, then turned her house upside down, looking for money and valuables. In the end, he took as much cash as he could find, grabbed her car keys, and drove off into the night in her car, a Dodge Dart. He left her there, bound tight, and with a gag shoved all the way down her throat. He didn't care what had happened to her as long as he got what he wanted. And because of that, Alice Curtis would end up suffering on the gag as well as her own dentures, alone in the dark, until she was no more. Paul John Knowles had stolen not only money and a car, he'd also stolen his first life. Knowles stayed in the area for a few more days, just driving around in this stolen vehicle. Eventually, he had the big brain idea to ditch the car. The Dodge was hot and he knew the police would be on the lookout for it. It took you a few days to figure that out, mate. Come on now. So on August 1st, 1974, he was driving around the area just outside Jacksonville looking for a place to dump his ride when he spotted two little girls walking on the side of the road. And yes, everyone, it's about to get grim. Oh, why? Can't he just kill adults? And I know it should be like, can't he just kill nobody? But I know he kills people. Don't do it to children. 11-year-old Lillian Annette Anderson and 7-year-old Millette Josephine Anderson. Having been a local of Jacksonville for most of his life, he was actually a family acquaintance of the girls. They had a good relationship with his mother. Sadly, it was that fact that sealed their fate. He knew Lillian and Millette would be able to recognize him, that they could identify him if things went sideways, and inform the police of where he went and what he was driving. So what did he do? Perhaps the most heinous thing he'd done up to that point. Pulling the car up with a screeching halt, Knowles, without hesitation, kidnapped both young girls and drove them to a nearby swamp. I can only imagine the fear and confusion Lillian and Millette must have felt to be snatched from the road by someone who they knew, someone who knew their families. And then, once he'd found a suitable location, he took each girl, one after the other, out of the car and strangled them to death, dumping 7 and 11. Dumping their bodies in the bog. They wouldn't be found until January, 5 months later, and only after the mayhem had come to an end. There are those in the police force who are skeptical of the validity of his claim of killing the girls, that it was a false confession, but it was widely accepted that he was indeed the killer of both girls. From there, Knowles drove the stolen car to Atlantic Beach, Florida on August 2nd, 1974. He still hadn't gotten rid of it, even after he'd thought about doing so. Only a day had passed since he'd strangled those little girls, and yet he had already set his sights on his next victim. He broke into the apartment of 49-year-old Marjorie Howie, who was strangled to death in her apartment soon after, her television having been stolen. He used a pair of her own nylon stockings to end her life, all for a TV. He didn't even keep the damn thing, since he gave it to another one of his former girlfriends as a gift. He knew what he wanted. He took what he wanted. And anyone who got in his way was as good as dead. And even people who don't get in his way. Fucking psycho piece of shit. Dickhead killer. The next attack is fairly up in the air. Apparently, soon after the murder of Marjorie, Knowles was on the road when he came upon a young woman who would later only be known as Jane Doe. She was hitchhiking, and so Knowles pulled over to help. It's unknown if her murder was sexually motivated, but regardless, he killed her there and then for the sport of it and dumped her body, which was never found. Things went quiet in Florida, but that's only because this monster had simply packed up shop and fled to a different state. He'd made his way up to Musella, Georgia, where he didn't waste any time. It was on August the 23rd, 1974, that Knowles would strike again when he broke into the house of 23-year-old Kathy Sue Pierce. For what we know, nothing was taken from the residence, so it appears that he simply wanted Kathy. After pouncing on her, he proceeded to strangle her with a nearby telephone cord until she was no more. The sad part? Kathy had a 3-year-old son who witnessed the whole thing. Thankfully, Knowles left the boy alive and simply exited after killing Kathy, but I only can imagine the horror mental scars that poor kid has to suffer through because of it. Did he stop there? Of course not, because he wasn't famous yet. That was his goal, and he wouldn't stop until he got it, no matter how many bodies were left in his wake. Road trip of death. Now, before we go any further, I felt like I must clarify one thing. Knowles wasn't just constantly on the road all the time. No, there was at least one place where he could always lay his head at night, and that was the house of his on-again, off-again girlfriend. Her name was Jackie Knight, and to this day she claims to have no idea that the man she invited into her house and her bed on more than one occasion was up to these devilish deeds. When she found out all that he had done and was doing under her nose, she was mortified. To quote, "He was around my children, babysitting my children while I'd go shopping or have to pay bills. He would do this, he would babysit my kids. You think if I had known he was killing these people, I'd have let my kids be involved? It was an embarrassment to me and my family that I could have been so naive to have gotten involved with someone like this, and I'm afraid they probably thought I might have been involved in some way. I knew something in some way. I didn't know anything that was going down in Macon or anywhere else. I know he'd be gone for up to 2 weeks, he'd come back, he'd stay 3 or 4 days, he'd be gone again, he'd sleep on the couch. He would always see to it that the kids had Christmas. He would see to it that they were well taken care of when it came to school. He took those kids as his own." I don't think it's your fault, Jackie. Yeah, I don't think it's naive. He's a psycho who's hiding this shit from you. Psychos are really good at that. That's what they do. So clearly, he had someone who cared about him. He had a woman, even kids who cared about him. He could have stopped. He could have settled down and still had a family, a good life. And yet he didn't. And he continued his rampage willingly. We next find Knowles in Lima, Ohio. And the date was September the 3rd, 1974. He was hanging out at a local bar, Scott's Inn, enjoying a drink, perhaps taking a bit of time to relax on his path of bloodshed, taking the time to wind down on his run from the cops. It was there that he made the acquaintance of 32-year-old William Bates, an account executive for Ohio Power Company. The two of them shared a few drinks, shared a few laughs, and Bates thought he'd made a new friend in this handsome, charming stranger, until the life was being choked out of him, that is. Knowles murdered William Bates that night and dumped his naked body in the nearby woods after stealing his money, his credit cards, and finally his car. Exchanging one hot car for another, he left the Dodge Dart at the inn, which was discovered by police and traced back to Alice Curtis. When Bates never returned home, his wife reported him as missing, and his body was discovered a month later. The bartender, a friend of Bates, recalled that they had seen William hanging out with a handsome red-headed man that night, and that they'd left together. No one knew his name, and so Knowles simply disappeared, having just claimed the life of his first male victim. Knowles was back on the road, back on the run, moving through California and Utah. He made his way into Nevada, where he came upon his next victims on September the 18th, 1974. They were 62-year-old Emmett Alexander Johnson and his wife, the 59-year-old Lois Mildred Johnson, two campers out for a nice camping trip in Ely, Nevada. The two of them were at a rest stop when Knowles came upon them. After taking them into the woods and binding them, he simply executed them with a gunshot to the head. Totally random, totally nonsensical, and the only things he took were their credit cards, which paid his expenses for a short time. He would then move to Texas, and it was there that he unfortunately kicked up his depravity a notch. He killed a 7-year-old. What the how are you going to get more depraved? But Matt, I hear you saying, he's already murdered several people and without any real rhyme or reason. How could it get much worse? Oh, it can get worse, though. Sexually, torture-wise, there's all sorts of horrible shit that he can do. Well, when you think of the phrase Casanova, you think of a player, somebody very sexual. You can probably tell where I'm going with this. On September the 22nd, 1974, 42-year-old Eben Charlene Hicks had stopped her car at a rest stop in Seguin, Texas, because she wished to admire the sunset. It was then that a car pulled up and a handsome stranger emerged, asking if she needed help. She didn't, but that didn't stop Knowles from helping himself. He attacked her and R-worded her, because we can't say that word on YouTube, before strangling her with her own pantyhose. Afterwards, he forcefully dragged her body through a nearby barbed wire fence, shearing her flesh and clothes, and dumped her in the nearby woods. Her family reported her missing the same day, and her car was discovered at the rest stop. It wasn't until 3 days later, on September the 25th, that a body was found. By then, Knowles had already come across his new victim. This was on September the 23rd, 1974, in Birmingham, Alabama. She was a 49-year-old beautician named Anne Jean Dawson. Throughout this whole script, I've described Knowles as a charmer, a ladies' man, and in this case, it seemed to be somewhat true. Upon meeting him, Anne seemed to have fallen for the pretty face and the silver tongue of our antagonist, and actually travelled with him for several days. They drove around, had some fun, and he let her pay for all of his expenses, until he seemingly got bored of her. On September the 29th, he strangled her and dumped her body in the Mississippi River. It wasn't until over 3 years later, on November the 15th, 1977, that her remains were found on the bank of the Mississippi by a pair of squirrel hunters. From there, he traveled through Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, but he never admitted to any murders in those areas, and none have been linked to him yet. The next incident was another robbery and sadly another fatality. This was in Marlborough, Connecticut, on October the 16th, 1974. On that night, Knowles broke into the home of 35-year-old Karen Wine and bound her and her 16-year-old daughter, Dawn Marie Wine. Both of them were utterly defenseless as Knowles made his way through the house, stealing a tape recorder. He then returned to Karen and Dawn, violated them, and strangled them. 2 days later, on October the 17th, 1974, he struck again in Woodford, Virginia. That day, he knocked on the door of 53-year-old Doris Hosey. Why did he pick her? Well, no reason at all, he just simply felt like it, which makes what happens next all the more infuriating. As soon as Doris opened the door, Knowles forced his way inside and found her husband's rifle. With no hesitation or second thought about it, he shot Doris dead right in the middle of her home. After removing his fingerprints from the gun, he simply laid it next to her body, exited the house, closed the door, and walked away. No sexual assault, no robbery, just a random act of deadly violence. And that is perhaps the most terrifying part about Paul Knowles. His utter randomness. Most serial killers that we've covered have some sort of pattern, some sort of characteristic most of the victims had in common. On top of that, most serial killers have at least some sort of waiting period between kills. It could be weeks, months, or even years between fatalities. But not with Knowles. His victims had nothing in common and varied with a wide range of ages, from children to the middle-aged. Sometimes he robbed them, sometimes he sexually assaulted them, and sometimes he killed them simply for the thrill of stealing away a life with his bare hands. Most of his attacks in those 4 months were only days apart, and only a couple of instances being weeks between killings. He simply enjoyed the feeling of murdering innocents. He was getting a kick out of it, and he was happy at the thought that he'd get famous over it. After this, though, he'd give himself a scare, and it would perhaps put things into perspective. Knowles continued to hop from state to state, still driving Bates's car. While driving through Key West, Florida on October the 25th, 1974, Knowles spotted 2 hitchhikers and stopped to speak with them. He put them into the car when they asked for a ride, and by now, we're going to know how this goes, right? He'd bind them, kill them, rob them, and dump them somewhere to be found at a later date. However, on this day, that wouldn't happen. As he was driving, Knowles got pulled over by a police officer for traffic violations. Despite driving a stolen vehicle, Knowles was able to turn on the charm and use his natural charisma to get on the better side of the officer and only received a warning. As he drove off, it was clear that not only had his plan gone awry, but the close call had spooked him badly. He drove his passengers to Miami, where he dropped them off, and after they thanked him, he drove off. He had someone that he had to talk to. He found a payphone, and he rang up Shelton Yavitz and confessed everything to him. That's the lawyer from earlier, right? The one that his fiancée from the prison hooked him up with. He asked Yavitz what he should do, but he refused to heed Yavitz's advice to turn himself in. Instead, he used the tape recorder that he'd stolen from the Wines family and recorded a confession, getting it all on tape. Every crime, every infraction, every murder and sexual assault, all on a little cassette tape. That night, Knowles met with Yavitz, but he kept it brief, staying only long enough to hand him the tape before he fled the state. Knowles knew that he could only get away with things for so long. Soon enough, something was going to go wrong. But until then, he would keep up his dark ways, though the end would come much sooner than he likely predicted. The final killing spree. November 1974 had come, and we're now on to the final act of the reign of terror of Paul John Knowles. Sadly, it still came at the cost of several lives. In November of 1974, the body of 22-year-old hitchhiker Edward Hillard was found in the woods of Macon, Georgia. He'd been shot 5 times. However, 20-year-old Debbie Griffin, his friend and fellow hitchhiker, was nowhere to be found. That is, of course, until August the 29th, 1975, when her remains were discovered in Crawford County, Georgia. It's never been outright proven that Knowles was the one behind their deaths, but it's known that he was in the area at the time of the murders, and it's widely accepted that he is to blame. If I can insert my 2 cents here, I believe that he killed Edward first on November the 2nd and forced Debbie into the car with him. What he wanted from her, I can't say, especially since no evidence of sexual assault was discovered on a decomposed body, but I wouldn't put it past him. And then, once he was done, he simply murdered her and dumped her body in a nearby area. It was after the death of the hitchhiking companions that Knowles met and befriended 45-year-old Carswell Hall Carr Sr. This was on November the 6th, 1974, just 4 days after the deaths of Edward and Debbie. Carswell was so taken in by the charming younger man that he invited him to have dinner with him and his 15-year-old daughter, Amanda Beth Carr, and to spend the night at his house. Oh my god, this guy must be like ultra charming. Knowles took him up on his offer, and we all know where this is headed, don't we? It was Carswell's wife who found them later on that night. She'd been working the night shift at her job when she came home and found that her entire family had been murdered. She called the police,
and upon arriving, they found the house was in shambles with books and furniture thrown about everywhere. It didn't take long to find the bodies. Carswell was in the master bedroom, naked and tied up, covered in blood. Knowles had stabbed him 27 times with what was determined to be a pair of scissors, though the cause of death was actually ruled a heart attack resulting from the attack. It is possible that Knowles hadn't meant to kill him, but it was torture, no more, no less. Yeah, if you stab someone 27 times, it's pretty fucking intentional to me. A friend and trusting man who had only invited him into his home, and this is what he got for it. It was then that Knowles had turned his attention to the daughter. Amanda never stood a chance. She was found down the hall in her room and had been strangled and gagged with a nylon stocking. After he was finished, Knowles appeared to have, attempted to have his way with her body, as if he couldn't have been more disgusting. He then wiped blood off the scissors used to torture Carswell, ransacked the house, and stole multiple items. Most of Carswell's clothing, his briefcase, shaving kit, credit cards, keys, and papers. He also stole Amanda's Mickey Mouse watch and the digital clock from her room, which had been forcefully yanked out of the wall. It was after this killing that Knowles made a decision. He was on his journey to becoming infamous, to becoming the world's most evil killer, and so naturally, he believed that a book would eventually be written about him, and that the legend would grow. So what did he do? He purchased himself a brand new tape recorder to go with the one he previously nicked, and he began recording. In the end, he had a multitude of tape recordings, each one detailing his life and more importantly his crimes. Talk about narcissism, but it's pretty on brand. In the meantime, his path to murderous glory had not stopped, though there was at least one person that he didn't kill. On November the 8th, 1974, Knowles wandered into a Holiday Inn bar in Atlanta, Georgia, wearing one of Carswell's suits. It was there that he met 45-year-old British journalist Sandy Fawkes. A graduate of Camberwell College of Arts, she had come to the US in 1974 in order to interview several celebrities for her employer, the Daily Express, though she hadn't been that successful. It was at the bar that her eyes fell on Knowles, and she described him as such. His gaunt good looks made him stand out from the crowd. Decidedly, he was very handsome, tall, well over 6 foot, broad-shouldered, narrow-hipped, and as slender as a wraith. Now, I wouldn't think of describing someone I'm attracted to as wraith-like, but that's just me. It's like a sexy wraith. The two of them started talking, and Knowles introduced himself as Lester Darrell Golden. The two of them had dinner together, and Knowles turned on the charm. Sandy was swayed by him, and they eventually ended up in bed. To say Knowles embarrassed himself is an understatement, since Sandy would later explain that he'd been unable to perform. He was impotent and had to actively stimulate himself to be able to do anything at all. I suppose if a woman actually said yes, and he wasn't forcing himself onto her, he simply couldn't get it up. Despite this little hiccup, the two of them spent 3 days together, perhaps the longest Knowles had spent with a woman without killing her. Hell, he even persuaded Sandy to drive him all the way to Miami, Florida, for an appointment he wished to keep. He seemed to enjoy her company, and she enjoyed his. His charm was working, and the way he carried himself, as well as his wardrobe and cars, made him seem like he had some money. Sandy would later explain that she knew something was off from the way his lips curled into an animalistic grin when he slept, and the way he seemed so fascinated by death. He told her that more than anything, he wanted to leave a mark on the world, on life itself, and she could see that he believed he would. It was near the end of their time together that Knowles brought up something interesting to Sally. He asked her if she'd be interested in writing a book. Well, about what, you might ask? Well, about him, of course, about his life. Knowles didn't outright tell her what he'd done, but he said that he'd done some pretty bad things and that he'd left a tape of all of it with his lawyer. He believed that he didn't have long to live, and soon enough it would all come out and she would have all the material for a book that she could possibly need. Perhaps it was because he had seen articles in the local newspaper discussing his latest murders, or the fact that said murders were suspected to be linked to several other murders he had committed, that he felt the net closing in on him, and he proclaimed the following to her: "Within a year, I will be dead." It's almost eerie how correct he was. It was November the 10th, and the two parted ways for the final time. The very next day, he offered a ride to a woman named Susan Mackenzie and held her at gunpoint demanding sex. Somehow, Susan managed to escape and inform nearby police, resulting in the officers trying to arrest him. To this, he brandished a sawn-off shotgun at them and managed to get away. The irony of it all, Susan was actually a friend of Sally Falk, and it was because of this incident that she came to learn who he really was and was horrified who she had spent time with. Remember the Mickey Mouse watch that Knowles stole from Amanda Carr? Well, he gave it to Sally, and she was disgusted when she realized that this gift had been stolen off the wrist of a murdered child. Yeah, no sh**. What the f***? With the police on his tail, Paul John Knowles was officially on the run, and he believed that one thing he could do to help his situation was take a hostage. No one ever accused this man of being smart now, did we? To do that, he traveled to West Palm Beach, Florida, and posed as an IRS agent, knocking on the door of 32-year-old Beverly McBee, a woman with cerebral palsy who lived with her twin sister and caretaker, Barbara Maybe Abel. As soon as the door opened,
Knowles was able to force his way inside, overpower Betty, and bound and gagged her in her bedroom. Inside the dark house, he waited for Barbara to get home and took her hostage. He allowed her to say goodbye to Beverly before he shuffled her into the beige Volkswagen and took off into the night. Beverly wouldn't be left to die, though, and she managed to wiggle out of her bonds. She managed to make her way to the nearest police station and told them what had happened. From her description of the man who bound and took her sister, the authorities quickly realized that this was the man they were looking for in connection with the recent string of killings. From there, Knowles took Barbara to Fort Pierce, Florida. After taking her to a motel room, he forced her down, bound her, and had his way with her. After he finished with her, Knowles just left. Just like that. He left Barbara tied up in that motel room, and he simply walked out the door, leaving her all alone. Now, thankfully, she was able to get out of her restraints, run out of the motel, and call for help, getting in touch with the police. This final act of mercy would be the downfall of Paul John Knowles. For some reason, he let Barbara live when he had killed so many before, and it was going to come crashing down on him. With a bang. It happened so quickly. It was the morning of November the 16th, 1974, and 35-year-old Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell probably believed that it would just be another day on the beat in Perry, Florida. That is until he was driving around and his eyes fell on a beige Volkswagen. Campbell had been briefed on the manhunt for the stolen car, and the man behind it had been made privy to the details, and he was staring at the car in question. Knowing the risks and without any worry for his own safety, he turned the lights on, pulling the car over to the side of the road. He drew his service pistol, got out of the car, telling the driver to get out of the vehicle, keeping his hands where he could see them. John Paul Knowles calmly exited the vehicle, and then all hell broke loose. He lunged at Campbell. The two men struggled, and in the end, Knowles managed to get Campbell's gun away from him. Holding the officer at gunpoint, fully at his mercy, he forced him into the back of the police car, and he got in the driver's seat, driving off in a now stolen police vehicle. Not exactly the first time he'd kidnapped a police officer, was it? And it only gets crazier from here. Now with a new hostage, Knowles wasn't done. Using the sirens on the cop car, he pulled over another motorist, this being 29-year-old James E. Mayer, a businessman from Delaware. Thinking it was simply a regular traffic stop, Mayer complied, until Knowles forced him at gunpoint to get into the back of the cop car as well. His new ride was full to capacity. The only question now was what to do with them. Sadly, Knowles knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was desperate, and he knew his time was running out, and he had no reason to keep these men alive, so he made his way into Georgia. Now the police were on high alert. They knew they were already looking for a murderer, a kidnapper, an R-wordist, but he now had two other hostages, one of which was a cop. They took every lead that they could very seriously, and they set up roadblocks at every exit that they could to the area where he was last seen. They knew he would try to get away. He was frantic to remain free and continue his murder spree, so it was only a matter of time. And they were right. It was the very next day, on November the 17th, that Knowles would show himself. Still in the stolen police car, Knowles was spotted by Henry County Sheriff Deputy Charles Hancock, and a chase ensued. Eventually, he ran into a police roadblock in Stockbridge, Georgia, before losing control and crashing the car. Knowles then leapt from the vehicle, fired shots at the cops to keep them a good distance, and hoofed it into the Henry County woods, vanishing from sight. Police quickly gave chase, with several of them investigating the car, hoping that the hostages were still inside and alive. Inside the car, they found a gun belt and hat that belonged to Campbell, but no sign of either Campbell or Meyer. There was no sign of any violence within the car, no blood, no bullet holes, no stab marks. So there was a glimmer of hope, and the hunt was on. The police scoured the forest in the search of Knowles. Dogs were on the trail and choppers were in the air. For 4 whole hours they searched, and it seemed like he might have gotten away again until a call came in. It was from a house near the woods, and they had a story to tell. The occupants said that only minutes before, a man wielding a shotgun, 27-year-old Vietnam War veteran and hospital maintenance worker David Clark, had come to the door, the shotgun trained on a tall, handsome man with reddish-brown hair. The man had come out of the woods while David was out hunting, asking for help. David had been following the coverage, though. He knew there was a criminal on the loose, so he held Knowles up, forcing him into the house, and asked the occupants to call the police. Absolute legend. Yeah, that is fucking balls. Good for you, mate. Henry County investigators Paul Robbins and Billy Payne arrived on the scene, and within seconds the handcuffs were on. Paul John Knowles had finally been arrested. But where were Campbell and Mayer? Well, the police wanted to know that more than anything, but Knowles had clammed up. You see, the second he was arrested and waltzed out of the house, he caught sight of the press and reporters that had come to see the madman who had been the bane of police for the past 4 months. He must have felt a wave of narcissistic satisfaction, since he had a huge grin on his face. He wanted to be famous, he wanted to be known, for all the attention to be on him, and it seemed that he'd got it. He toyed with them, he played little games, doing anything he could to be the center of their world, even just for a little while. The cops were desperate, though, and they knew that if the two men were alive, they wouldn't be for long if they weren't found. But it was all for naught. Several days passed with no clue as to where the hostages were, and Knowles still wouldn't talk. Then, on the night of November the 21st, 1974, a group of hunters were making their way through the woods of Pulaski County in Georgia when they came across a grisly sight. The bodies of Trooper Campbell and James Mayer were lying face down and lifeless on the forest floor. They had each been handcuffed to a tree and had a bullet hole in their heads, execution style. There was never any chance, never any hope, since they'd been dead from the start, and Knowles had just been stringing everyone along for the sick fun of it. 2 more souls were lost in his crusade for attention, and now Knowles was officially a cop killer. He's getting the death penalty, right? He's definitely getting the death penalty. At that point, Knowles was linked to at least 12 murders that the police were aware of. That changed very quickly, though, as the process started getting underway and the dark truths were brought to light. Remember his lawyer, Shelton Yavitz? Remember the taped confession he'd given him? Or how about all those tapes in his makeshift journal that he'd started recording? Well, all of those were brought forth by Yavitz at the insistence of the authorities, and it gave them a dark insight into how depraved and evil Knowles really was. It wasn't just 12 victims that lay in his wake. Today, it's widely accepted that Knowles' body count stands at between 18 and over 35 victims. Knowles, proud of it all, made it known that upon his death he wanted all documents and tapes about him to be made available to the public. He wanted the world to know his name and know all he did. The search for fame never stopped with him. Shelton Yavitz has since gone on record calling Knowles the most heinous murderer in history. So, I know what you must be thinking. Obviously, they went to trial and threw the book at him, right? This insufferable prick was so brash and outspoken on what he did, a proverbial murder glory hog, that there was no way there's anything that he could do to stop himself from getting anything but the death penalty. Hell, they already knew what that was the sentence for him, which is probably why he did what he did next. He kills himself, doesn't he? For sure. You see, there'd never be a trial. There would be no prosecution or defense, no judge or witnesses, none of it, because he'd never make it that far. On December the 18th, 1974, only a month after finally being captured, Knowles was set to be transferred to a high-security facility to await his trial, but there was something he was charged with doing. He admitted to the authorities that he'd dumped Trooper Campbell's service weapon in the woods of Henry County, and he could take them to it. Assigned to transport him were Sheriff Earl Lee and Agent Ronnie Angel from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They loaded a handcuffed Knowles into the back of their car and were driving down Interstate 20 when it happened. The entire time he'd been in the car, Knowles had been at work. Someone had gotten hold of a paperclip while in custody and had been sneakily picking at his handcuffs. As soon as he freed himself, Knowles made his move. He lunged toward the front of the car and reached Sheriff Lee's gun, resulting in a struggle in which the gun actually discharged in the holster. Spinning around in the seat, Agent Angel didn't hesitate. Taking hold of his own pistol, he unloaded 3 shots on Knowles, each hitting him square in the chest. It was over in a matter of seconds, and the evil bastard fell back and slumped down in the backseat of the car, blood pouring from his chest. It seems that his prediction to Sally Fawkes was right. He was never making it a year, only 40 more days, and he got his wish to be shot before he'd taste the music for his actions. Paul John Knowles, the dickhead killer, was dead at age 28. Yeah, and that is suicide by cop or whatever, because that's what's going to happen. But also, he's made an error, because at the beginning I was contemplating about why this guy's not as famous, and I think it's just because he didn't have a trial. Like, he didn't have this huge public spectacle of it all being drawn out and stuff. And he didn't have to kill anyone more, and it'd been a whole lot more famous if that had happened. It's like kind of an idiot, really. Wrap up. And that, as they say, is that. I fully admit that this script turned out to be much longer than I'd anticipated, but that's only because I underestimated the sheer evil of the antagonist of this piece. Paul John Knowles was a deplorable, despicable human being, a vicious narcissist who simply wanted everyone to know who he was. He was a glory seeker, a fame chaser, and he would assault and kill anyone in his way to get what he wanted. Well, at the very least, I can say he never got what he wanted. Not many people know the name Paul John Knowles. He's very much one of the lesser-known serial killers in US history, only really though known to those who read up on true crime. It's brilliant. Just leave it that way. This guy shouldn't be any more famous. Just let his memory be forgotten. That's it. Colossal douchebag, the dickhead killer. Why is that, though? He had willed it that all of his tapes and documents about him be released for the public to see. Well, it's a bit of a bittersweet situation here. After his death, all of those tapes, all of his recorded journals, were either lost or accidentally destroyed by the freak flooding or mishandling of evidence. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's I guess for closure for the victims and stuff. But considering that this guy wanted to be famous, I think it's really nice that he's not. Bittersweet, because while it's good that this freak's words never get out to inspire others to kill for attention, it's also evidence lost, evidence that could have been used to finally identify any lost victims. On that note, as recently as December 2011, one of the lost victims of the dickhead killer was identified through the tapes, that being 13-year-old Imogene Sanders, who disappeared on August 1st, 1974 in Warmer Robins, Georgia, and whose skeletal remains have been found all the way back in April 1976, but were unable to be identified until 30 years after her murder. The reason it took so long to get her family closure? He mispronounced her name as Alma, not Ema. Such a small mistake, ending with a lifetime of heartache. And I don't blame the police for being so slow in catching him either. No, me neither. The police work in this, no fault. I don't see any problems. Like, his victims were totally random. It all happened extremely quickly over multiple states. I think this guy was just like a brutal killer who acted too quickly. His victims were random, with nothing to link them back to Knowles at all. He only killed them for either notoriety or because he needed things such as money or clothes. He cut a path of blood and bodies all over the country, all within a span of 4 months, and I thank God he was captured when he was. Think about it. Well-known or not, Knowles was unfortunately good at what he did. Here's a comparison. In 4 months, John Paul Knowles killed between 18 and 35 people, maybe more. Ted Bundy, one of the worst serial killers in human history, is believed to have killed over 36 people over 4 years. Think about it. And in the end, there's likely more than a dozen lost souls still out there, unidentified, waiting to be found. With all that said, as the darkness pulls back once more, I wish to remember the victims that we do know of. They didn't deserve what they got, being the random victims of a narcissistic murderer. Alice Henrietta Curtis, Imogene Sanders, Lillian Annette Anderson, Millette Josephine Anderson, Marjorie Howie, Kathy Sue Pierce, William Bates, Emmett Alexander Johnson, Lois Mildred Johnson, Eben Charlene Hicks, Anne Jean Dawson, Karen Wine, Dawn Marie Wine, Doris Hosey, Edward Hillard, Debbie Griffin, Carswell Hall Carr Sr., Amanda Beth Carr, Charles Eugene Campbell, James Marr. May they rest in peace. Sandy Fawkes, who passed away in December 2005, always wondered why he let her live. Perhaps simply so his tale would live on, and I suppose that choice did pay off, as she did end up writing that book titled Natural Born Killer, and it's both a bestseller and considered the definitive work on Knowles. And Barbara Maybe Abel, the woman he kidnapped, she went on with her life, emotionally hurt from the experience, but she continued to live regardless, eventually writing her own book called One Survivor. Good on you, ladies, and congratulations on overcoming the darkness to find your own light. Rot in hell, Paul John Knowles, you arse hat. Will gladly not remember you. Yes, indeed. And that's where we end today's episode. Thanks for being here, watching or listening, and I'll see you next time.